Hey guys, so for this part of the series, we'll be looking at integrating more plugins to accomplish some common business needs like building a web view or decoding assets or caching. So a common example is so this is what we had based on our previous part, right? Just a list of like the top headlines for the skim and list UI, and then say if I wanted to click it, right? Say, just to like view it in more detail, because we're just presented with the title and the time it was published ago. So ideally, we would take the user to the web view, right, being provided the URL. Or say if I wanted to select something else besides Google News, right? Considering that there's so many other media outlets out there, especially because the News API provides more than that. Like say if I had a UI, a picker, that I could select a media outlet for. Or say another example is if I wanted to default to my favorite media outlet every time I close the app and then reopen, and then I'm presented with the media outlet I chose last time. So that'll be the point of this video. So as always, the branch for this part is already pushed out. Okay, so without further ado, let's start off with the Webview plugin. So if you go to pub.dev, basically there'll be two Webview plugins you see right off the bat. There's one that's from the Flutter team, and run from the community run. Okay, I think it's this one right here. All right, so basically why you want to go for the Webview that's built by the Flutter team is because it's ingrained within the widget tree, as opposed to a separate layer that renders over a native view. So as you'd expect, if it's not part of the widget tree, there's limitations where you can't really surface some views on top of that web view, right? So that's the community run web view, whereas this one kind of allows you to have that full-fledged experience of interacting views on top of views, even the web view. Or dependency, just copy and paste this. Okay, knock off this to-do statement here, and then flutter pub get. Okay, cool. So you know how the simulator opened, right? So if we were to click on one of the list items, that ideally take us to the web view, right? So with this list tile in mind, we want to pass in an on tap. But before we do that, right, to make the list item tappable, we want to have a widget or a web view that uses the plugin we just downloaded. So why don't we create a new helper file for the widget, call something like helper article web view widget. Cool. So why don't we create it right here? So call it that extend stateless widget. All right. Create the build for the stateless widget. All right, cool. So for the web view, we want to basically have the article URL, right, to obviously load into the web. And then what we could also pass in is, as you guys know, for part of the scaffold, right, for the material themes UI, by default, we want to, pass in an app bar, right? That way it's displayed platform level for both Android and iOS. So I was thinking for the title, maybe it could be something like a text and then maybe the title of the article, right? Yeah, should probably open up Postman just to show some sample responses of what exactly I mean. Pass that in, get the articles. So something like this maybe, the title property. And of course we're not going to fit the whole text, right? It's obviously too long, so probably be ellipses one line. So And to obviously access the article properties, we need to pass it in as the field. And then constructor. Okay, maybe make this required. All right, import this. Then use the field to pass in the title. All right, and here's where we actually put in the web view. So body and then a center widget. And then here's where we put in the web view. Okay, so basically, if you go back to the pub page, it'll have some example usages, right, of how to actually use it. So it's a pretty long sample snippet, but just know that the key components that we should actually pay attention to is the initial URL, and then the JavaScript, and the JavaScript mode, whether to enable or disable the flag. Okay. So initial URL. Because if you look at the parameter within the WebView file, it'll default to, I believe, is disabled. Yeah, so JavaScript.mode disabled, and I believe there's like 2 of them. So to disable or to not restrict. So enable in this case. Just to make, give the user more functionality and like options to like interact with the web view, because that's the least we could do. Anyways, cool. So there's our helper web view widget. And going back to the list tile within our main.dart file, if we pass in the onTap parameter, so every time they tap on this, we want to take the user to the web view. And while I code this out, so there's what's called routing in Flutter. Basically, that's like dealing with your the screen stacks, right? So these are like, for both Android and iOS, is platform adaptive transitions. So not only are you like presented with a new screen, right, on top of the one you just accessed previously, you'll get like some platform specific user interface. So an app bar is a good example in which you're going to see later on. But this is like the default way to handle screen stacks in Flutter. So but we'll be using what's called the material page route, right? So this is like the page route we'll be using. And here's the documentation and what it does. And we basically pass in a widget of what exactly we want to take the user to for the next screen. Text and context. Okay. Then we pass in the widget we just created. Article, and then we pass in the article we initialized up here. All right, cool. Why don't we try running that? All right. So basically, if I press one of these, so notice that I'm on a simulator right now, iPhone 11 Pro Max. So if I just hold on to an item, right, notice you get like a ripple effect, implying that it's clickable. And then once I actually tap it, there's the title of the article, and then notice that I'm taken to the web view here. And with JavaScript enabled, we could click on some of the UI. There it is. And here's the, so considering that we are in a page route on the iOS platform, so this is how it'll look natively for iOS. So the title is centered, and then here's like the default back button, right? So if I press back like that, it'll take us to the previous screen. Or you could swipe from left to right like that. But yeah, you'll see this on Android as I run it later. As you can imagine, it's like the default back button there. and then the title would be left aligned instead. Cool. All right, moving on. So that's the web view. Another cool plugin we could use, right? So going back to like selecting another media outlet, we would need like a picker interface to do just that. So there's what's called the Flutter Picker plugin. So search that. Yeah. So here's like a sample GIF of like each of the type of dialogues and modals you could choose from this plugin. In our case, we'll be using one of the picker modals, right? So basically, there's all the sample snippets of like based on, each of these buttons and the respective picker UI he's like showing. So in our case, we'll be using like the picker data adapter. Okay, so for starters, why don't we go ahead and download this pub. Okay. All right, so you're probably wondering what options, right, we should provide to the user for like how many media outlets that we could give to the user to select, right? The answer is that as much as like the news API provides us, really, right? So Google News is one of them, and if you go to the website, right, there's like some other sources, right? Another one is TechCrunch, right? But fortunately, over the course of my time using this, API service, I've been able to compile up a list of like all the ID name sources for all of the mainstream media outlets you may know, right? So, and you could actually like test and make sure that these IDs work, right? So going back to Postman, and then with the source query param, if I just pass in that instead of Google News and do a search, notice that it's now Ars Technica. Say if you've had enough of Google News for once. All right. So that's exactly what we're going to do, right? We have this, static JSON file of all the list of sources, right? Also, obviously there are strings right now, but we're going to try and decode this and map it into a source object. So what we had over here, right? So there's the ID and name. ID for passing in for the endpoint call, and then name for displaying it in a user-friendly way. Okay. So for starters, we're going to try to decode the asset, and how you do that on Flutter for like accessing an asset. Ooh, that's a tongue twist. You want to basically, if I could do this. So the path of this JSON file is within the assets directory, right? So to access that, I just simply assets and then / news sources.json. Okay. But don't need that to-do statement anymore. All right, and then next, what you want to do is create a function to create it just right here. All right, so it'll be a feature type. List source. Maybe call this function something like load new sources, JSON, build context. Okay, and then it'll be in an async block for this computation. All right. Okay, so basically how we want to load this JSON string is we first initialize it as a string and then call the await default asset bundle, takes in a context, load string, and then the path we just created in our pugspec YAML file. All right, so if this helper widget of default asset bundle, basically it takes care of like loading our asset files, right? So in our case, a string. And then what you want to do is handle the decoding part, which will be JSON.decode data. And then I believe we gotta import this. Yeah, Dart. Okay. And then now we can handle the mapping part. So we could initialize a new variable called something like new sources, JSON result as a list, and then map each element to deserialize it. Remember the helper from JSON function we created in the source class? Pass in the element, and then dot to list. As you'll see here, if I hover, right, it returns a list of sources, which is exactly what we want. And then you just simply return it. Cool. So where should we call exactly? Question. Basically, now we want to go back to the Flutter Picker plugin, right? And actually import it, because first, before we pass in the list of source names, we probably want to pass in the function before, showing the list to the user. Okay, so for what we could do now is make the app bar just like a simple button, right? That would display the Flutter Picker. So I was thinking we could put it maybe somewhere on the app bar, because fortunately it takes in an actions parameter. So widgets, and then an icon button. So for the icon, I was thinking something like collections bookmark, which looks something like right there. It's like that bookmark / favorite thing you see in Chrome or whatever. Okay, and then let's align it to the right for now. Center right, that is. And then as you'd expect, the on press is the callback to handle every time that button's clicked. And then that's when we want to invoke the function of displaying the dialog. Okay, so let's make it a private function with the underscore at the front, of course. Build context. All right. So we want to have our new sources, right, that we just decoded from that static JSON file. So let's actually await the asynchronous call, pass in the context, right? So to display like a source of list names, right? So in our case, like that, instead of an ID, which is not going to be as UX friendly, right? We want to map each source object to just its source name. So map each element, maybe call this something like source instead. Source.name, and then simply to .list. If I hover over again, notice that it lists a string. All right. And here's the fun part. Why don't we just make our lives easier and copy and paste some examples. Okay, this looks pretty good enough. New picker dot. So this should be picker data adapter. Of course, we gotta import the package. All right. Cool. So here's our adapter, right? That takes the data before it shows it off as UI. The picker data is basically the list, right? In this case, it's a generic list. but in our case, it'll be a string, right? So we just simply pass that in there. Change it first. We don't need that. We do want to hide the header, but we want a title, as those are two separate entities. So maybe call this something like, okay, let's not use any style for now. So on confirm, right, you're presented with like a confirm and cancel button. So confirm is once you actually make a selection based on the picker. So going back to the README here, right? So you could like scroll through the list, and whichever item you settle on before pressing confirm is the item you'll select. Okay, so why don't we handle the selection logic within this block here? So again, to make our lives a little bit more easier, we could create a helper function here, new source selected. They basically take in the list of sources. Sync block. All right, so basically the list, as you see here, this parameter, so it'll be just a single list of like the index of like based on the item you confirm, right? So to select, you know, based on the index, we want to make sure that, say if like the third item's collected or selected, right? That's when we pass in an index of 2. So to retrieve the source ID, right, before passing it into the get call to update our list, right, is you want to, so basically here's our list, and then the list size will always be 1. So the index of the new sources list, and then the ID of the source, right? So with that source ID, we could just simply make that get new source call that we created from the very beginning, right? So maybe paste that something like this. And then we could update this function by passing in the source ID parameter. Okay. Pass it in there. Notice that for the existing invoking functions of the get new sources, right, now it's throwing errors that we're now passing in the source ID parameter. So it's pretty cool because in Dart, how you default it to like an optional, or defaults as an optional parameter, is you just wrap it in curly braces and pass it in just like that. So equals defaults to Google News. Pass in the key and then the value of what we just created here. All right. Okay. So if we were to press this app bar action app at the top, we just invoke the picker dialog function we just created. And every time we make a selection within this picker dialog is when we handle the new source selection logic, which looks right in there. All right, so no more errors. Why don't we try running this now? Okay. Notice that defaulted to Google News, right? Considering that's the default optional parameter here, right? But say if I were to make a selection, that's when it actually passes a source ID argument. All right, so going back to our good old Ars Technica, there it is. Just refresh the list, right? And then going back to the web view, and that's how Ars Technica looks on the web, but in our case, a web view. All right, one more. Third time to just make sure it's right. Probably got one out. Cool. All right, awesome. Now for our last plugin, to finish things off for the night is caching the selection of, like, say, our favorite media outlet. So for you Android devs out there, if the name shared preferences doesn't ring a bell, here it is. But fortunately, it's handled on the iOS platform as well, right? So it's in this case is NS user defaults, the shared preferences on Android. So pretty simple to use, but again, for starters, let's install it. Okay, so copy that, paste it here. Flutter pub get. So while we download that pub, which is probably done by now, here's like a simple. I actually found this example rather interesting, just because with that Flutter default project you work on, right? You use that increment counter app, right? But in this case, they're actually going as far as like caching it every time like it's counted, right? So here's the state within a stateful widget, and then it defaults to initializing a counter int, or it defaults to 0 if the cache doesn't exist yet. Otherwise, they keep incrementing it every time the button's clicked, say within this increment counter function. So here's the sent int, right, for the shared preference instance you created. So this is to update the cache, and here's to get, right? So in our case, we'll be using a string for the new source ID we select to eventually cache. All right. So we could create the getters and setters here. So it'll basically be a feature. New source pref ID. Go asynchronously. All right. So we could initialize our shared preference instance here for now. Get instance. And then basically every time we get it, right? So instead of get int like that sample showed us, it'll just be get string. And then for the key, use source pref key for now, right? And then if it doesn't exist, we want to default it to something, right? In this case, Google News. Okay. Now for setting it, so no return type, that's void. So set string, right? To update the cache, it'll be the same key as here. I know I should probably initialize this as a constant, but I'll do that soon. And then takes in the source ID there. Okay. So probably wondering where exactly we want to create this, right? We probably don't need this default parameter anymore, right? Considering that we have the logic done here, right? So it'd be simple as initializing the source ID here instead by just getting the cache. Good. So now that we have that set, we don't need this default parameter anymore. All right. But for setting it, we could set it right here, right? Once a selection is made. So await set new source pref ID source ID. Okay, so now we just simply update. All right, I think that's literally it. Let's see if I get any errors. All right. Okay, so so we have Ars Technica here, right? But say if I wanted to select it to something else like CBS News, right? To test out that if this ID was actually cache, let's literally just close and reopen it. And then it should show CBS News, fingers crossed, and there it is, right there. And then say if like, the app has its cache removed, then it should show Google News by default, right? We could do that on Android right now, just because it'd kind of be overkill. Do you want to install the app on iOS and then reinstall and run it? So I thought this would be a good segue to do just that. Alright, brace your ears, guys. Gonna get noisy from this emulator from being too expensive. Alright, so now that it's opening, it should show Google News, just because the cache doesn't exist yet. And there it is. Cool. Alright, just to stay sane. Here's how the Webview will look on the emulator. Alright, so you present it with nav drawer, and notice that with JavaScript enabled, we could play around with this stuff in the web. Okay, so now that Ars Technica is selected, let's make sure it's cache and then reopen it. And then it should show Ars Technica. Just like that. Alright, guys. Again, I appreciate you staying on this thus far. So 3 plugins, as I mentioned, accomplishes a lot of tasks these days in demand. So, and then here's like some common implementation of how to use it. Very basic. I would not be surprised if there's other, optimal ways to use these plugins. But obviously this is a pet project. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave in a comment. As always, or reach me via Twitter. The handle will be in the description below. But otherwise, until next time, guys, I'll see you later. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.